Brad Keith Sigmon was convicted for the brutal 2002 double murder of his ex-girlfriend's parents, David and Gladys, in a fit of jealousy and rage. Sigmon ambushed the couple in their home, beating them to death with a baseball bat and stealing valuables. The crime was senseless and brutal, driven by Sigmon's personal vendetta after a breakup. His actions left 2 innocent people dead, and he was sentenced to death. After spending nearly 2 decades on death row, Sigmon became the first person in 15 years to be executed by firing squad in South Carolina, marking a chilling chapter in the state's use of capital punishment. Welcome to True Crime OCS, where we dive deep into chilling real-life mysteries, unsolved cases, and the darkest corners of true crime. Subscribe and hit the notification bell for more gripping stories and in-depth investigations. It was still dark outside when the prison stirred awake, but in one cell, light had never truly left. Brad Keith Sigmon hadn't slept the night before. Not really. A man with 2 decades on death row likely grows used to sleep being optional. But this night was different. This night was final. At 6:47 a.m. Sigmon's final hour began ticking down in a prison that had rehearsed this day in secret for months. On paper, it was an execution. In practice, it was history being rewritten. 15 years had passed since a firing squad was last assembled in the United States. The method long vilified, rarely discussed in mainstream circles, had faded into a dark corner of American penal history. But on this quiet April morning, in South Carolina's Broad River Correctional Institution, it returned with a vengeance. Brad Keith Sigmon would be the first. Born in 1969 in Greenville, South Carolina, Brad Sigmon was by most accounts unremarkable. His early years were marked by instability, bouncing between foster homes and relatives, grappling with addiction and petty crime before his 25th birthday. But it wasn't until 2002 that his name would be seared into state headlines. On July 27th of that year, 57-year-old David L. and his 62-year-old wife Gladys, the parents of Sigmon's ex-girlfriend, were found beaten to death in their home. The attack had been savage. Both had suffered blunt force trauma, and the home showed signs of forced entry. According to prosecutors, Sigmon had spiraled into a jealous rage after the end of his relationship. Court records would later detail a chilling plan. He had waited for the couple, used a baseball bat to ambush them, and fled the scene after robbing valuables and setting up an alibi that quickly unraveled. The trial was swift, the evidence overwhelming. In June 2003, after barely 2 hours of deliberation, the jury returned a unanimous guilty verdict. Days later, Sigmon was sentenced to death by lethal injection. For nearly 2 decades, Brad Sigmon sat on death row, his name lost among the dozens of men awaiting their end. But fate and politics had other plans. By the late 2010s, a quiet crisis had begun brewing in American prisons. The lethal injection drugs were running out. Pharmaceutical companies, wary of litigation and moral backlash, began refusing to supply the necessary cocktails to states with capital punishment. South Carolina, like several others, faced a dilemma. With over 30 inmates on death row and no legal way to carry out sentences, executions had ground to a halt. In 2021, lawmakers proposed a solution: resurrect the electric chair and legalize the firing squad as alternatives. The bill passed with a narrow majority. Controversial, yes. Constitutional, still debated. But for the state, it was a path forward. Sigmon, scheduled for execution in 2022, became the first test case. As execution loomed, journalists were granted limited access to Sigmon's prison file. The man described therein was a paradox, soft-spoken, highly literate, and deeply religious in his final years. Prison chaplain Greg Morton recalled a man haunted but not broken. He never denied what he did, Morton said, but he asked for peace, not forgiveness, not sympathy, just peace. In the weeks leading up to his death, Sigmon wrote several letters to surviving members of the victim's family. Their contents remained sealed, but prison officials confirmed he expressed remorse and took full responsibility for the killings. "Don't sugarcoat what I did," Sigmon reportedly told his spiritual advisor, "but don't let them forget I was a man too." Sigmon's final meal request arrived exactly 24 hours before execution. The contents were unpretentious: 2 cheeseburgers with everything, fries, a slice of pecan pie, and a bottle of root beer. Staff psychologist Emily Carter, who had worked with death row inmates for nearly 10 years, he described it as a very Southern farewell. "There's a strange intimacy to the last meal," she explained. "It's the last act of control. You can't stop the needle, the bullet, or the clock, but you can choose that plate." Sigmon reportedly ate everything but the pie. "He looked up at me," one guard said, and said, "You know, I never liked pecan pie. I just wanted to smell it one last time." Just minutes before the walk to the chamber, Sigmon was asked if he wished to deliver a final statement. He paused for nearly 20 seconds before responding. His words, brief and deliberate, were relayed by a corrections officer outside the chamber. "To those I hurt, I'm sorry. I carry it every day. I'm going home now." Unlike past executions, there was no prayer offered aloud, no quoting of scripture, just the sound of chains rattling gently against concrete. At precisely 7 o'clock, Brad Keith Sigmon was led into a newly built chamber outfitted for the firing squad. It was Spartan and silent: white walls, a single wooden chair, sandbags, and a blood-absorbing rubber mat. He was strapped in by 5 officers. A black cloth was placed over his chest to mark the target. A hood was pulled over his head. 5 marksmen, shielded behind a brick wall, stood 15 feet away. Only one rifle contained a blank. No one would know whose bullet was the kill shot. 3 seconds later, a volley of shots rang out. Sigmon slumped forward instantly. A medic confirmed death at 7:14 a.m. Outside the prison, protests had begun the night before. Human rights organizations and anti-death penalty advocates called the execution medieval, barbaric, and a national shame. "The United States should not be in the business of shooting its citizens," said Amnesty International's U.S. Director Erica Guevara Rosas. "This isn't justice, it's vengeance wrapped in procedure."